let's just finish up with Perkins' life and career. And that brings us to the whole matter of his death. Now, as we see here, apparently he died of complications related to kidney stones in 1602. Now, here are some interesting observations regarding his circumstances at the time of his death. At the time that he died, his wife of 7 years was pregnant. She was also caring for 3 small children, and then on top of everything else, she was already grieving the life or the loss of 3 other children to various diseases fairly recently, which reminds us of a very stark reality in that world. In that world of the 16th century, 17th century, the mortality rate is very, very, very high, and especially the child mortality rate. One of the reasons various families intentionally had a lot of children was because there was the distinct possibility, if not likelihood, that a good number of those children would not make it to adulthood. And so it would be common in this period for a family to have maybe altogether about 7, 8, 9 children, and then maybe have 3 of them, if even that, make it to adulthood. Because the mortality rate, as I said, was very, very, very high. And so Perkins himself obviously had lived with that even while he was ailing himself. Now his close friend Samuel Ward, who was a theologian in his own right, was actually a member, would later be a member of the British delegation to the Synod of Dort, wrote concerning his friend, "God knows his death is likely to be an irrevocable loss and a great judgment to the university, seeing there is none to supply his place." So that's the life and ministry of William Perkins. Now, what we want to do here is I want to just touch on his major works here quickly. The first of these is his cases of conscience. Now his cases of conscience is really this is his classic work exploring this area of casuistry. Casuistry meaning, again, questions of conscience, questions of conscience, cases of conscience that would involve a very rigid kind of self-examination, then followed by a scriptural diagnosis. Or in other words, a scriptural solution for whatever question of conscience one happens to be going through. Now, I believe you have an excerpt of Perkins' cases of conscience, and what I'd like us to do is, especially after lunch, I'd like us to kind of do what we did similarly right before the time that we adjourned for lunch, and that is what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes to read over this. This excerpt is about it's about 2 pages. Just take a few minutes to just read over it, and then after about maybe about 5 minutes or so of just going over it, then what I'd like you to do is again, just through the kind of group discussion that we had before, just go through the excerpt and then identify from it about maybe 4 means that God uses to bring people to faith, and then as a pastor, because remember, Perkins is writing this with pastoral ministry in mind. How would you incorporate these things into preaching and counseling? Because remember, this is what Perkins is concerned with. So right now, just take a few minutes to read over it, and then I'll let you know when you can. They can then discuss it in the way that I've mentioned. Try to chat with one another about finding about 4 means that God uses to bring people to faith, and then also determine, all right, how can I incorporate these ideas into both my preaching and my counseling as a pastor? I think what we'll do is we'll start with you, and I'll just whichever one of you has agreed to be the spokesman, we'll hear from you. Now that's interesting, and that really sort of addresses, and I think in part it might even answer the question that Yepsica had raised. Does Perkins hold to a kind of preparationism? It seems that Perkins is advocating a type of preparationism. And by the way, this would, and as we mentioned earlier, this would be something that would be very, very common among some Puritans, although not all. Because what happens is there are some Puritan scholars who would allege that all the Puritans held to this kind of preparationism, and it becomes very apparent that they didn't. Much later than Perkins, one of the most influential ministers among the New England Puritans, his name was John Cotton, certainly didn't hold to that. That would be another example. But oftentimes, there's in the West, and particularly in the United States, in popular evangelism, there's this idea of, well, come forward. There's an evangelistic meeting. Come forward. Pray the prayer. Pray the prayer, and if you pray the prayer, you're saved. Now, and in some contexts, now again, I don't know. Now again, gentlemen, please let me. I'd be interested in hearing from you how this plays out here in Ethiopia or Kenya or Somalia. But your point about campus ministry is spot on, because then a lot of youth ministry is not much different, whereby you get young people really emotionally worked up. You use all kinds of means with which to do that, and then you tell them, okay, now all you need to do is just come forward and pray this prayer. And then with younger children, and again, I don't know how this plays. Now again, gentlemen, help me out here in terms of how this would compare to this region, Ethiopia or Kenya or Somalia. But you're dealing with young children. You have the Sunday school. There's the well-meaning Sunday school teacher, and or some well-meaning adult, and the adult says, "Okay, boys and girls, which of you would all like to go to heaven?" Well, obviously, if you're dealing with little kids, you can get, guess what? Guess how they're going to respond? They're all going to raise their hand. We all want to go to heaven. And then the sweet lady tells them, okay, boys and girls, if you all want to go to heaven, then pray this prayer. And then, as you mentioned, James, what happens in some of these youth events, these really large-scale youth events, they really arouse the emotions, oftentimes, and where in the gospel itself may or may not be clearly presented, and then they say that they're quote unquote saved based on what was sort of an emotional kind of event. So I really appreciate your point, James, there about, from a pastoral standpoint, it might be important to see whether or not, somebody's really converted. And certainly from what we're seeing depicted here by Perkins, that would certainly be one of his concerns. Very well done, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Just a couple of things as well, and I think some of this came out. The first thing is from this section is as many of us have observed, salvation for Perkins is all grace. Now, in this context, salvation, as we've gathered here, doesn't just simply refer to the point of conversion. Perkins and others of this period would have understood salvation to refer to the whole of the Christian life. So the salvation of the Christian, his or her entire life, is one of grace. Another important factor we see here is, Perkins' employment of the law-gospel dynamic, and that's very clear. In how he describes the function of the law, both in a general sense, but then also in a very, very personal way. There's a sense in which the law conveys the knowledge of sin, what's right, what's not right, and then obviously the consequences of that. And then there is the confrontation by way of the same law with how we ourselves then personally offend God. And then it's interesting at that point where Perkins observes that so far the initial reaction to the law in despair, in fear, and so forth, is not itself really salvific grace at work, because that kind of reaction to the law can be expected from the quote-unquote reprobate. It could be expected, obviously, from those who are not Christians, because the confrontation of the reality of one's own sin in all of its ugliness will invoke fear and despair on part of anyone. But then where salvific grace comes into play is where then that grace prepares one to receive the gospel, to receive Christ who's proclaimed by the gospel. So it's interesting here to note that what's also implied here seems to be a third use, sort of this third use of the law as well, on the part of Perkins. So, any questions or comments about this particular passage from Perkins' Cases of Conscience? That's a great question. It's kind of something that Yepsica had brought up a little while back, and that's also something that James mentioned. That's you know what, Issachar? That's a great question, and it doesn't seem that Perkins talks about that. He seems to heavily emphasize this kind of preparatory stage. This kind of preparatory stage between being despairing, which consists of just despairing over one's sins, doubts, and this sort of thing, until the event of conversion takes place. And in many cases, though, as we said earlier, this is not the rule with all the Puritans, but certainly this was the case with enough of them that when it comes to the reading of individual journals of the Puritans' own kind of spiritual life, they speak of this kind of preparatory state, and when especially in New England, when members of a Puritan congregation would come and give an account of their conversion to the elders. Oftentimes, according to the records that are kept by many, though not all, but by many there in New England, you do have this kind of experience where there's kind of this preparatory stage leading to conversion. Arguably, Jonathan Edwards later on speaks of something like this in his youth. Now it's interesting in this regard. I mean, within what we might call earlier evangelicalism, and especially when it comes to later revivalism and things like this, you do have references to something like this, where there's kind of this preparatory struggle with one's sin and doubt and despair and so forth, as kind of this necessary step towards conversion. So in many cases, this becomes quite common to quite a few conversion narratives. Certainly in the 17th century, certainly in the 18th century, and in some cases, even during the 19th century with the rise of revivalism, both in America and then in England, vice versa. So what I'd like to do now is spend some concerted time discussing Perkins' art of prophesying. And what I'd like us to do is just kind of go through various passages of the text together, discuss it, and then, gentlemen, as we discuss it, I'll lead the discussion. I've got a whole bunch of questions, but then as I'm leading through with various questions, and as we discuss various aspects, please feel free to bring up observations that you have in the midst of it, and ask questions and so forth as well. So that's where I kind of like to go with this. There was another assignment I was going to have us do, but I figured, okay, you're doing this thing on Baxter. I'm not going to burden you suddenly with something like this. So I think it might be, and I also think it might be more helpful for us just to kind of walk through various parts of this treatise on, quote unquote, the art of prophesying, and then see how various aspects of this can be applied to pastoral ministry as well, because this book was intended to be a handbook for pastors. So, it's in your reader. Let me just check the. Yeah. So it starts. So it kind of starts on page 1 of your reader. Now, without getting controversial, because we're just simply dealing with gentlemen, with a historical source. I want to ask this question from Perkins' standpoint, not the standpoint of anyone else, just Perkins' standpoint. Because again, what I find, I know I mentioned this earlier, but what I kind of find amusing about this is that this is kind of in anticipation of the topic of a given sermon on Sunday, and that's the whole question of prophecy. However, in some, as you have read through this, or at least most of it, how does Perkins define prophecy? Yep, the preaching of the word. Now, looking at it from this context, the preaching of the word is going to be the most common definition of prophecy given not only by the Puritans, English reformers, and then even the continental reformers. Now, this kind of goes back to something that we had touched upon very briefly, I think it was yesterday, and this has to do with some training in preaching that had started in Zurich, and then some of the English evangelicals who were in exile in Zurich during the reign of Mary brought this idea back with them and then sought to implement this to help train others to preach, and that was called the prophesyings. And in these exercises, groups of ministers would meet. There'd be a passage, and each one of them would preach on this passage before their peers, and then afterwards they would receive feedback from their peers as to strengths, weaknesses, and so forth. But the purpose of it was sort of a collegial effort to train one another to preach. Now, as we recall from yesterday, the Queen Elizabeth I wasn't too crazy about this because she was always afraid of the potential fomenting of disorder that unchecked preaching could help foster. So for that reason, she outlawed these prophesyings, ordering her Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund Grindal, to put a stop to the prophesyings. He encouraged the prophesyings, and so he refused. And then as a result, Queen Elizabeth I placed him under kind of suspended him from all his responsibilities, although he still retained his office. But then he was pretty much under house arrest, a type of house arrest, for the duration of his tenure and hence the rest of his life. But nevertheless, the preaching of the word was the most common definition for prophecy among the Puritans and certainly the Reformers. Okay, very good. Thank you. Now, does anybody have any other comments about this? Many of them would say that any kind of proclamation of the Word of God is prophecy, and then they would argue. Most would argue, as a matter of course, that in the New Testament, prophecy then becomes synonymous with preaching, since preaching is the proclamation of the Word received and inscripturated. Now again, context is everything. The Reformers, especially the magisterial Reformers, and then by extension the Puritans, would be scared to death of of any other view of prophecy in this regard, for the simple reason that there were some radicals among some Anabaptists, and then later on, this also happened in New England with Ann Hutchinson and the antinomian controversy, and that is that there's always the fear that somebody is going to assume the posture of a self-appointed prophet and give some alleged prophecy, claiming this is from the Spirit. This is given to them by the Spirit of God. To the point, then, this would foment in some kind of order. I mean, a good example of this come from earlier in the 16th century with Martin Luther, where he had to contend, and I guess they were Anabaptists of sorts. We're not really sure, but they would have been called enthusiasts, but they were self-proclaimed prophets. They were from the German town of Zwickau. That's why they were called the Zwickau prophets, in which they are making, they're giving what they are purporting to be various revelations by the Spirit regarding various things in church and society. Probably the most infamous person in this vein was one by the name of Thomas Müntzer, who through his alleged revelations fomented the Peasants' Revolt in 1525, which turned out to be quite a horrible conflict, which the nobility crushed, resulting in the deaths of hundreds and thousands of peasants. And then probably one of the most infamous examples of this would have occurred in 1534 in the German city of Munster, where there were two individuals. One of them was probably the most infamous was a gentleman by the name of Jan van Leyden, who also professed himself to be a prophet, and further argued that his revelations exceeded the teachings of Christ and the apostles, as was also the case with Thomas Müntzer before that, and it was based upon these alleged revelations and prophesyings that he led an army of followers to take over the entire city of Munster and try to impose some kind of a mini theocratic kingdom involving socialism, forced polygamy, sharing, common possession of wives and all that stuff. Well, that had proven to be such a threat that for once the Protestant authorities and Catholic authorities actually made common cause to take the city and then execute all these people who were involved. But really it was for reasons like that. Also in the late Middle Ages, there were various mystics who claimed to have various prophetic revelations, which then sometimes would tend to disrupt the social order. And so for those kinds of reasons, the magisterial reformers and then the Puritans being their heir, as we see in this case with William Perkins, were very, very careful to then ultimately define prophecy or prophesying as really the preaching of the word. So so all that to say, yes, there's a high regard for what they understood to be sola scriptura, the sufficiency and finality of Scripture, but there are also these other considerations too, which would have factored into this very, very controlled definition of prophesying in this case. Any other questions or comments about just about how Perkins is defining prophecy? Yeah, many of them would allege that these were individuals giving words of exhortation under the careful oversight of the elders or whoever. So they were certainly they would say that this pertained to those unique times in the New Testament, and they no longer apply. So there's also, in the 16th and 17th centuries, there's also this concern. There's also a concern for social order, and that concern for social order is also driving some of this too, whereby it would be disorderly to let a woman let a woman exhort. They would say that these were exceptional instances that were just simply unique to that particular time and place, and was no longer normative. So this is just another instance in which context, among other things, does factor in the interpretation and the exposition of Scripture.